It comes to a time when you know every move, and you have to find somebody else to play with.
As you listen to music today, I don't know if you listen to the radio a lot or if you listen mostly to records.
John Lennon, a musical genius, a peace symbol, and one of the most influential artists of the 20th century. He and the Beatles changed the world of music, but his brilliant life ended tragically under the gun of a crazy fan. Why did a person who always called for peace become a victim of violence? What made the assassin so cruel? Let's explore the ups and downs of John Lennon's life and the shocking event that took this legend away forever. Childhood and the path to music. John Winston Lennon was born on 9th of October 1940 in Liverpool, England. During the tumult of World War II, bombs were falling across the city as his mother, Julia Lennon, gave birth to their first son at the maternity hospital. His father, Alfred Lennon, was a merchant seaman who was often away from home, which caused a rift between him and Julia. When John was 5, his parents officially separated. Julia, although loving her son, could not care for him long-term due to the precariousness of life, so she entrusted him to her sister, Mimi Smith, a strict but devoted woman, to raise him in a small house at 251 Menlove Avenue, Liverpool. Aunt Mimi always reminded John that music will get you nowhere, but she also made sure that John had a stable life and a good education. Although living with his aunt, John kept in touch with his mother, Julia. Unlike Mimi, Julia was free-spirited, and it was she who first instilled in John a love of music. She taught him to play the banjo, then the guitar, and often listened to the rock and roll of Elvis Presley, who would become John Lennon's biggest idol. However, John Lennon's life soon suffered an inconsolable loss. On July 15, 1958, when he was 17, his mother, Julia, was hit and killed by a drunken policeman in front of his Aunt Mimi's house. Her sudden death left a deep psychological wound in John's heart. He always felt a sense of loss, torn between his feelings for his deceased biological mother and his strict but responsible adoptive mother. This event also had a profound influence on his musical style, which was later evident in such emotional songs as Mother, Julia, and My Mummy's Dead. Despite his troubled childhood, John Lennon showed early artistic talent. He inclined toward drawing and wanted to become a painter, but music was his greatest passion. In 1956, while studying at Quarrybank High School, John Lennon formed a skiffle band called the Quarrymen with some friends. Skiffle is a genre of music that blends folk, jazz, and blues, and was very popular in England at the time. The group often performed at small parties and local events. A major turning point in John's life occurred on July 6, 1957, when he met a 15-year-old boy named Paul McCartney at a music event at St. Peter's Church. Paul quickly impressed John with his virtuoso guitar playing and incredible memory. He could memorize song lyrics after hearing them just once. Recognizing Paul's talent, John invited him to join the Quarrymen, and a lifelong friendship and artistic rivalry was born. Soon after, Paul introduced another boy named George Harrison, who was only 14 years old at the time, but already had incredible guitar skills. John was initially skeptical because George was so young, but after hearing him play raunchy, he was convinced and let George join the group in 1958. By 1960, the group officially changed its name to the Beatles after adding drummer Ringo Starr in 1962. They began performing in small clubs in Hamburg, Germany, and gradually became one of the most influential bands in the history of world music. The Beatles Peak. By the 1960s, the Beatles had transformed from an obscure Liverpool band into a global phenomenon, completely changing the face of popular music. With a lineup of John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, and Ringo Starr, the group created a wave of passionate fans known as Beatlemania. spreading throughout the UK, Europe, and then exploding in the US and around the world. In 1962, the group released their first single, Love Me Do, marking a humble but promising start. This song showed a bright, simple, but extremely attractive style, helping the Beatles begin to attract attention in the UK. Then, in 1963, with two hits, She Loves You and I Want to Hold Your Hand, the Beatles officially conquered the US. The second song climbed to #1 on the Billboard charts, making the group an international music phenomenon. Beatlemania exploded when the group appeared on The Ed Sullivan Show in February 1964, attracting a record audience of over 73 million viewers at the time. In 1965, the Beatles entered their creative peak with groundbreaking albums such as Help and Rubber Soul. Songs such as Yesterday, one of the most covered songs in history, Norwegian Wood, a break with the Indian sitar sound, and Help, the metaphorical cry for help by John Lennon, demonstrated the group's musical and songwriting maturity. 1967 marked an important artistic turning point for the Beatles with the album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, considered one of the greatest albums of all time. Songs like Strawberry Fields Forever and A Day in the Life reflect the group's boundless creativity, especially the strong influence of John Lennon in bringing surreal and philosophical elements to the music. The Beatles were not just a band, but also became a global cultural icon, shaping the lifestyle, fashion, and thinking of an entire generation. Their music not only created new trends, but also reflected the social upheavals of the 1960s, from the anti-war movement to the sexual revolution and the spirit of protest. John Lennon was not only a founding member, but also one of the main creative minds of the Beatles, while Paul McCartney tended to play light, easy-to-listen melodies. John brought deep, philosophical and somewhat dark songs, reflecting his rebellious soul and inner struggles. Typical songs that show the mark of John Lennon include In My Life, 1965, one of John's most personal songs, written to reminisce about his childhood, memories, and the people he loved. This is a deeply personal song, demonstrating Lennon's flair for lyricism. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, 1967. A controversial song that many believe alludes to LSD, but John claims it was inspired by a painting by his son, Julian Lennon. The song has a surreal tone, reflecting John's boundless creativity during the psychedelic rock era. Revolution, 1968. Written during a time of political turmoil, this song expresses John's views on revolution and social change. The first version had a softer melody, Revolution 1, but the group later recorded a stronger version to send a clearer message about their views. In addition to his genius songwriting, John Lennon also played an important role in shaping the style and image of the Beatles. He was a pioneer in experimenting with new musical genres, from psychedelic rock to avant-garde, and was not afraid to incorporate deep, personal, or political themes into his music. John Lennon's rebellious, outspoken, and sometimes ironic personality also contributed to the Beatles' appeal. However, it also caused him to clash with the other members, especially Paul McCartney, when the two had differences in artistic direction. It was these tensions that eventually contributed to the group's breakup in 1970. They were the biggest band in the world, but then it all fell apart. Were quiet disagreements, artistic conflicts, and the arrival of Yoko Ono the main reasons? Or are there secrets that have yet to be revealed? Let's explore the story behind the breakup of the Beatles, a sad chapter in music history. Leaving the Beatles. Late 1960s. Internal conflicts began to arise, especially between John Lennon and Paul McCartney, the two key creative figures of the group. This was not only a personal issue, but also related to artistic direction, financial management, and influence from external factors. One of the main causes of conflict between Lennon and McCartney was the difference in songwriting style and musical vision. McCartney tended to favor pop, ballad style with easy-to-listen, emotional melodies, while Lennon tended to experiment with new, unconventional things, even incorporating surreal or political elements. When recording the album The White Album, 1968, the tensions began to become more evident. This was an album that marked a growing separation between the members when many songs were no longer collective as before, but were performed by each individual separately. Lennon once criticized the album as not the Beatles anymore, but four guys recording solos on the same album. During the recording process, Ringo Starr even left the group for a short time because he felt he was no longer being taken seriously, although he later returned. George Harrison also began to feel frustrated that his compositions were not included on the album, despite his increasingly recognized songwriting talent. Another controversial element was the appearance of Yoko Ono, the woman who was John Lennon's greatest influence during the final stages of the Beatles. Lennon met Yoko Ono in 1966 and was quickly attracted to her artistic ideas and life philosophy. He saw Yoko as someone who could help expand his artistic vision beyond the framework of the Beatles. Unlike the other members, Lennon often brought Yoko Ono to the studio during the recording process, which went against the group's unwritten rules. McCartney, Harrison, and Starr were all annoyed by Yoko's interference in their songwriting and recording. But Lennon didn't care. There have been rumors that Yoko Ono was the cause of the group's breakup, but in fact, the Beatles had conflicts before that. Yoko's appearance only increased the distance between Lennon and the other members, especially McCartney. In addition to disagreements on songwriting and the influence of Yoko Ono, financial problems were also one of the important reasons leading to the Beatles' breakup. After Brian Epstein, the group's manager, died in 1967, the Beatles fell into chaos in managing their finances. McCartney wanted the group to hire Lee Eastman, his future father-in-law, as financial manager, while Lennon, Harrison, and Starr supported Alan Klein, a businessman who had worked with the Rolling Stones. The failure to agree on a manager caused further internal rifts within the Beatles. McCartney did not trust Klein, while Lennon believed that Klein could help the group make more money. After many years of tension, the Beatles officially disbanded in 1970. John Lennon was the first to want to leave the group. In September 1969, in an internal meeting, Lennon declared to the members, "I want to get out of here. I want to be free." However, to avoid affecting the sales of the album Let It Be, the group kept this information secret. In April 1970, Paul McCartney officially announced his departure from the group through a press release accompanying his first solo album. McCartney, this was a big shock to fans and marked the end of the Beatles. On April 10, 1970, the Daily Mirror published a shocking headline: "Paul McCartney leaves the Beatles," shocking the public. After that, each member continued their solo career, but nothing could replace the group's golden age. John Lennon had been out of the spotlight for years to enjoy family life, but was that the end of his musical career? When he returned in 1980 with Double Fantasy, he seemed ready for a new chapter. But fate had other plans. Solo career and peace message. After leaving the Beatles, John Lennon entered a new chapter in his career with the desire to affirm his artistic personality and spread the message of peace. In 1971, Lennon released the album Imagine, in which the song of the same name quickly became one of the most iconic songs of all time. The lyrics are simple but full of philosophy, depicting a world without borders, without war, without hatred. Imagine is not only a musical work, but also a powerful declaration of peace, used in many movements around the world. Not stopping at music, Lennon also actively participated in anti-war activities, especially against the Vietnam War. Together with Yoko Ono, he organized events such as an bed-in for peace, where the two of them lay on a hotel bed for many days, receiving reporters to convey a message against violence. He also released Give Peace a Chance, 1969, which became a peace anthem and was sung by thousands of protesters at rallies. However, it was Lennon's strong political views that brought him to the attention of the US government. Under President Richard Nixon, the FBI kept a close eye on him, concerned about his influence on the anti-war movement. They opened a file of more than 300 pages on Lennon, constantly pressuring him to be deported from the US. For many years, Lennon fought a legal battle to stay, and in 1976, he officially became a permanent resident of the US. In 1975, Lennon's life took a major turn when his son, John Lennon, was born on his 35th birthday. After years of spending most of his time on music and politics, Lennon decided to step away from the spotlight to focus on his role as a father. He stopped recording, did not participate in any musical projects, and retreated to live a simple life with his family in New York. During this period, Lennon spent time cooking, taking care of Sean and enjoying simple pleasures, something he had not had the opportunity to do during the height of his fame. After 5 years of absence, in 1980, Lennon suddenly announced his return with the album Double Fantasy, a collaboration project with Yoko Ono. The album reflected his true feelings about love, family, and life, with songs such as Just Like, Starting Over, Woman, or Watching the Wheels. This was considered a new beginning, a new chapter in his career where Lennon was ready to devote himself to music once again. However, the dream of a brilliant revival of John Lennon did not last long. The Tragic Assassination. On December 8, 1980, John Lennon began his day like any other at his apartment in the Dakota, a famous apartment building in New York City. In the morning, he and Yoko Ono had a photo shoot with photographer Annie Leibovitz for Rolling Stone magazine. It was also the legendary photo of a naked Lennon embracing his wife, the last image of him before his death. That afternoon, Lennon and Yoko left the house to go to the record plant studio to work. As they walked out of the gate of the Dakota, a man approached. It was Mark David Chapman, an old fan of Lennon's. Chapman held a copy of the Double Fantasy album in his hand and quietly handed it to Lennon to sign. Unaware of the danger ahead, Lennon happily signed the album and asked, "Is this all you want?" Chapman nodded, and Lennon and Yoko continued on their way. A seemingly ordinary moment, but it was a premonition of the tragedy to come. At around 10:50 p.m. that same day, John Lennon and Yoko Ono returned home from a recording session. As they stepped out of the limousine and walked toward the building's entrance, Chapman was still standing there, quietly waiting. As Lennon passed by, Chapman pulled out a Charter Arms .38 revolver and fired 5 shots into his back. Lennon staggered, trying to take a few steps toward the front desk of the Dakota, mumbling, "I've been shot. I've been shot," before collapsing to the floor. The building staff quickly called an ambulance, but the wound was too severe. An ambulance took Lennon to Roosevelt Hospital in a state of excessive blood loss. At around 11:15 p.m., John Lennon was pronounced dead at the age of 40. Mark David Chapman was no stranger. He had been a fervent Lennon fan, but over time, that admiration turned into a twisted obsession. Chapman grew up in an unstable family environment, had a history of mental illness, and had repeatedly heard voices in his head. He was particularly deeply influenced by the novel The Catcher in the Rye by J.D. Salinger. Chapman saw himself as the character Holden Caulfield, a man who hated the hypocrisy of society. In his disturbed mind, Lennon saw a man who called for peace but lived in luxury was the hypocrite who needed to be punished. Before the assassination, Chapman had planned to kill Lennon many times. He had traveled to New York a few days before, but hesitated and returned to Hawaii, where he was living. However, the voices in his head continued to urge him to carry out the act. On December 6, 1980, Chapman bought a gun and flew back to New York, determined to commit the crime. Strangely, after shooting Lennon, Chapman did not run away. He calmly sat down on the sidewalk, opened The Catcher in the Rye, and began reading, as if nothing had happened. When the police arrived, he did not resist, simply saying, "I just shot John Lennon." Chapman's cold-blooded act shocked the world. He was arrested at the scene, sentenced to life in prison, and has not been pardoned to this day. But no matter how long Chapman is imprisoned, he has robbed a great musical icon, leaving inconsolable pain in the hearts of his fans. Have you ever thought that an idol could become a target of his fans? It's hard to say. Even after his death, his music, ideas, and messages continue to inspire millions. But what makes Lennon's legacy endure today? Legacy and influence. John Lennon was not only a singer and songwriter, but also a cultural icon, with great contributions to music and social movements. After his death, Lennon's influence has not diminished, but has been increasingly affirmed over time. One of Lennon's most important legacies is the song Imagine, a song considered as the hymn of peace. Released in 1971 on the album of the same name, Imagine carries the message of a world without borders, without war or hatred, where people live in peace and sharing. The song has become one of the most influential songs of all time, often played at events for peace, from memorial services to social movements. Every New Year's Day or at important events, such as the Olympics, Imagine resounds as a reminder of the dream of peace that Lennon once pursued. In addition to Imagine, Lennon's other solo songs, such as Give Peace a Chance, Happy Xmas, War is Over, and Working Class Hero also continue to have a strong vitality. These songs not only reflect Lennon's artistic soul, but also make strong statements about politics, anti-war, and human rights. Although the Beatles disbanded in 1970, their influence has not diminished. More than half a century has passed. The Beatles are still the best-selling band of all time, with hundreds of millions of albums sold. Later generations of musicians, from Oasis and Coldplay to Ed Sheeran, have all been influenced by the songwriting style of Lennon and the Beatles. Classic albums such as Revolver, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, or Abbey Road are still considered masterpieces with profound influence in music history. And on October the 9th, 1985, Lennon's 45th birthday, New York City officially named a section of Central Park Strawberry Fields in his memory. The sudden death of John Lennon on December 8, 1980, caused a huge shock around the world. Not only a fan, but also celebrities, leaders, and colleagues expressed their grief. Immediately after Lennon's death, millions of fans poured into the streets, holding prayers and memorials in many places around the world. On December 14, 1980, at the call of Yoko Ono, millions of people around the world observed 10 minutes of silence to remember him. In New York, more than 225,000 people gathered in Central Park, near the Dakota Building, to share the pain of loss. In the UK, a series of memorials took place in Liverpool, Lennon's hometown. People placed candles and flowers in front of his old house, as well as in front of the headquarters of EMI, the record label that was associated with the Beatles. In Japan, thousands gathered at the Chokokuji Temple in Tokyo for a special memorial service for Lennon. Not only fans, but also Lennon's former bandmates were shocked by the tragic news. Paul McCartney shared, "I can't believe it. It's a real shock." George Harrison said, "John gave so much to the world, but sadly, the world took his life too soon." Ringo Starr, who was in the Bahamas when he heard the news, immediately flew to New York to comfort Yoko Ono and Lennon's son, Sean Lennon, who was only 5 years old at the time. After Lennon's death, Yoko Ono devoted much of her life to preserving his legacy. She continued to work in the arts, organizing events in Lennon's memory, and sponsoring many peace movements. One of her most important projects is the Strawberry Fields Memorial, the Lennon Memorial in New York's Central Park. This place has a stone engraved with the word "Imagine," where hundreds of people still come every day to lay flowers and sing Lennon's songs. Lennon's legacy lies not only in his immortal songs or prestigious awards, but also in the spirit of fighting for peace that he left for future generations. His name lives on forever in the hearts of his fans, as a symbol of love, creativity, and dreams for a better world. What changes do you think Lennon would have made to music and the world if he was still alive? Please share your thoughts in the comments section below. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel for more interesting updates. Thank you and see you in the next videos.